Now, the federal government has opted to reduce total budgetary spending on 2016 capital expenditure plan ahead of indication that the budget would not be implemented fully. The Minister of Finance, Mrs. Kemi Adonshu, who gave this indication in London while addressing international investors, said the decision was favored against an option of increased borrowing to plug the increasing revenue gap. Now, what is the implication of this for capital expenditure in the 2016 budget and, of course, infrastructure development? I'm being joined now by an economist and the Director, Center for Infrastructure, Policy, Regulation and Advancement at the Lagos Business School, Dr. Bongo Adi. Good afternoon, Dr. Adi. Good to have you in the studio.
Good day.
Now, what do you make of this plan by the federal government to cut down on the capital expenditure?
I think it's very obvious. The basic parameters on which the revenue projections were made have changed, especially the oil production, which has declined significantly between the time the projections were made and now. The budget projected oil outputs of about 2.2 million barrels per day. But right now, I think it's anything between 1.4 to 1.6 million barrels per day. So that's a very huge shortfall. So meaning that government is losing revenue. In fact, the short spike we've witnessed in the oil price, international oil price, in the last couple of days is simply because of the deficit coming from Nigeria. Nigeria not being able to meet up its quota. So that is what has spiked the oil price. So we are not benefiting from that essentially because we are losing production. So we are not making as much revenue as we had projected. So it's just natural for the government to somehow scale down its ambitions for this year.
Now, the question a lot of people would ask is why the capital expenditure? And don't forget that this government has always said, oh, they are serious about infrastructure development, and that was why a huge amount for the first time was allocated to capital expenditure. So why do we have to cut it down and yet we'll still pay salaries?
Yes. A lot of people are losing their jobs now. Just a few days ago, I think the government wanted to sanction banks for sacking their workers. So, of course, that's very politically sensitive issue, the issue of job. Part of the reason why governments are voted into power is to guarantee the jobs and livelihood of citizens, not to worsen the situation. The situation is already bad, so government thinking for Nigerians would really not want to compound their problems by laying off workers. So when we talk of recurrent expenditures, if they want to cut on that, it means that they have to sack a lot of workers. And then we have to consider the social and political upheaval that will be consequent upon that decision. So I think given that thinking, because I'm sure that's what's going on in the minds of the policymakers at this moment. So the thing to go will be the capital expenditure.
Now, looking at this whole budgetary process for this year, 6.06 trillion, that's the highest ever.
Yes.
What is your understanding of the scenario, this particular budgetary scenario?
Yes, government started off by being very ambitious because they wanted to deliver a huge impact at the shortest time possible. Okay, I will suppose that's the thinking that government started off from. But unfortunately, they didn't anticipate or foresee what is currently happening in the Niger Delta. Okay, so that's why they could go that high in terms of not just the budget, but particularly capital expenditure, because that's the highest we have seen in this country historically. So yes, it would have been a very good thing if that could have happened. But given what is experiencing now, the risk profile of the country has increased, and the cost of borrowing, if you look at the emerging market bond index, has been going up over the past few months. So meaning that it's costing us more to borrow in the international market. So borrowing is not even going to solve our problem, because we are tending towards the age of the high debt situation that characterized the economies in Africa in the past few years. So highly indebted poor countries. I think we're approaching that scenario again because many African countries are going to the international market borrowing. Nigeria is also joining that rank. And it's never a good thing. I mean, if we have a huge debt overhang, then we now have to talk about debt servicing, which again increases. So how do we balance all this? It's a very difficult situation for the government.
Now, government is yet to start, spending, so to say, and the year has already gone half. And let's look at the budgetary year, March to March next year. How, if they haven't started spending, what's the guarantee that, what they even have for infrastructure development would be implemented?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. I also have, but again, we remember that they somehow shifted the budget a year by about 2 months rather than March. I think they said the budget will run till May next year. So, okay, that's good in itself. But again, I want to make I just have to distinguish between rhetoric, propaganda, and actions. So what we have seen with this government is that they are very high on rhetoric, but when it comes to actions, they tend to be scoring very low, okay? And we have seen what has happened in other places. We are still using the same institution that failed to deliver in the last regime, because it's one thing to point accusing fingers at politicians, but we know that there are also bureaucrats in the civil service who have mediated the corruption that everybody seems to be talking about. Yet nothing has happened. So heads are not rolling. We've seen what is happening in Tanzania. That is a president that's shown real capacity to implement change. So we haven't seen that here. So I doubt the government's capacity to execute.
Yeah, one problem you actually mentioned while you were talking is the attacks on the oil installations. Looking at this now, is zero oil output a scenario that perhaps we will have to begin to contemplate?
It's really unfortunate that we're even coming to that thinking right now. That is something we should have thought about years ago. How could an economy build its future on a single commodity that suffers the vagaries of international price manipulation and whatever? So we needed to have considered this before now. Yes, it's a likely scenario. Even, okay, no matter what, we know that oil is an exhaustible commodity. It's going to finish one day. So perhaps the time is right for us to begin to think about an alternative.
Now, you did mention that having to go to international bodies in terms of raising funds, that will be adding to our debt, profile. With the situation we have found ourselves, we have 2.2 budget deficit. How are we going to fund it? What are the other funding options?
Well, I'll give you an example with what has happened in the city of Milan in Italy. There's what they call shadow banking, okay, which is some of these financial activities that are not under the jurisdiction or regulation of the central bank or the monetary authorities of the country. Shadow banking, we're looking at pension funds and other institutional investors, which seem not to have been brought into the picture, factored into all this. We have about, I think the pension fund is now hitting to 6 trillion naira, and nobody's talking about it in the funding of infrastructure. But of course, nobody wants such monies to fritter away unaccounted for, because that is what is likely to happen if it's brought in. But before we can really call in the pension funds, we need to improve the regulation, we need to improve the transparency situation in the country and accountability, so that we know that monies are utilized effectively and appropriately. So if we can have those institutional incentives set put in place, then I think the time is ripe to call in institutional investors like the pension funds. So that is an opportunity for the government. They need to begin to look inwards. How do we use the shadow banking system to fund some of this infrastructure?
What about the area of taxation? How are we fully utilizing that?
There is a limit to what you can tax. In an economy that companies are sacking, revenues are dropping, companies are not making profits. So profit after tax is declining, and then tax definitely will decline. So there is a limit to what you can hope to mop up from tax.
Now, we've seen the current challenge by state governments to actually pay their workers' salaries. Do you foresee another round of bailout for these state governments?
That's very likely, but I don't know where the fund to bail them out will come from. I think that's just it.
Perhaps they will go borrowing again, just as you mentioned, and then they have to keep borrowing.
Yeah, I think we're in a very difficult situation right now.
Right. And so are we going to see, I was just mentioning that, in the light of the unfolding scenario, now you talked about the pension, which of course we have not actually tapped into, and there's little we can do with taxation. Perhaps the option left now is to go borrowing. And when we are borrowing, where are we looking at? Where should we be borrowing from?
Well,
and at what percentage should we be borrowing?
I don't know, but if you are perceived as a risky borrower, that means the interest rate on your fund is going to go rooftop, right? Roof high. So you expect, I mean, how do you convince an investor to come into your system, into your market to invest when you are a risky borrower? So you have to pay the risk premium, which will increase astronomically the interest rate that we hope to pay. Would that be good for us in the long term? I don't know. We need to work that out. But an alternative could be going the way of public-private partnership. Again, that will require some sort of sovereign guarantees. And if you have to call in the private sector to build the infrastructure that you need, then given the risk perception, given the fact that government doesn't have much option, it means that you really have to give a lot of concessions to the potential private partners.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Bongo.